Everyone in Yankton had said it, as if the town could speak fate into being. She would die alone in winter. They said it in the post office when they passed Violet Turner's name on the ledger without looking her way. They said it at Mrs. Patterson's parlor window, where the women fussed over the patterns of her shawls and the way she kept to herself. They said it at the blacksmith's, over cups of coffee and splinters of conversation, as a certainty that settled on the town like frost. Violet had heard it often enough to feel its weight, but she had never believed that words were bricks enough to build a grave. The wind that night made a liar of the town's verdict. It arrived with a hunger that did not belong to spring or autumn, but to a long, merciless winter born out of the hills and the open plain. It boiled over the ridge and poured into the valley, a living thing that looked for any warmth to steal. The sky was one swollen, blind white. Snow came in sheets and in knives, slicing at anything that dared to stand where it should not be sheltered. Violet rode because she had to. Mrs. Henderson's cough had worsened, the woman's chest rattled like a locked washboard, and the only bottle of medicine left in town sat like a last coin in the apothecary. The medicine would keep the fever from taking hold, at least long enough for the neighbors to light the stoves and warm blankets, and for the doctor to make the trip if the roads allowed. The thought of a small parlor lit by a single lamp, of an old woman alone and gasping, was too much for Violet to leave to the wind. She did not ride because she was reckless. She rode because she knew how to ride and because someone else's life sometimes required more courage than remaining safe. Her gelding, a dark bay with a white star like a coin turned down on his forehead, stepped deliberately into the storm. He had been with her since the spring, when she'd bought him from a man leaving for the railroad. Good stock, he'd said. Good enough to trust now, when trust was all she had. She wrapped her coat tight to shield the draft and drew her scarf over her mouth. Even then, cold felt like a small animal at the back of her throat, industrious and hungry. Snow packed at the hems of her skirts and settled into the welt of her boots until every movement became a negotiation with the elements. The world narrowed to hoofbeats and breath, to the thin line of the path and the way the gelding's ears kept flicking back as if listening. Violet let herself feel the animal's heat against her shins and the steadiness at his shoulders. She sang under her breath the kind of old hymn her mother had taught her in Boston, not for God as much as for the rhythm the verses gave to her heart. It smoothed the jagged edge of fear. She had been a Boston woman born and trained in a kitchen of books and common sense. Widowhood had moved her west and taught her other trades. Widowhood had taught her how to sew patches, mend fences, and measure rationed flour by the eye. It had also taught her how to take orders from the wind without believing it entirely. She lost the trail near the dry arroyo. One moment there was horizon. The next, there was a world of white. The gelding refused, then turned his head, snorting into the air as if to say he had been betrayed. Something in Violet's chest clenched. Her hands went numb, first the left, then the right, until even the pulse of the reins was a rumor. She pulled her hood down and tried to whistle a clear note, anything to make sound in the slope of that silence, but the wind swallowed it. The snow made the earth one long surrender. Violet's mind began to go slow and heavy, like a wheel that refused to turn. Each breath tasted metallic. She thought, as people do in those waning moments when the light is simpler and memory takes a kindly, dishonest shape, of small things. The lace curtains of her first rented room in Yankton, the way Mrs. Patterson folded a pie cloth without a single wrinkle, the scar on her left palm from a skillet that slipped. She thought of her husband's laugh, quick and rare, and of the fever that had stolen him in a summer she could not now place by the date. She thought of the bottle of medicine in the apothecary, and how Mrs. Henderson's hands had once pressed her own with a gratitude that had made Violet's throat burn. She had not intended to believe in rescue. The frontier had taught her the usefulness of silence and the righteousness of making do. Yet something in the world, some small refusal on behalf of another, turns a person's facts. She heard a sound that might have been a prayer or might have been a gust that filled the hollows. She saw through the white a shape, dark, moving with deliberate intent. A man came out of the storm like an idea manifest. He was a silhouette against a world of white, wide-shouldered, wrapped in a coat whose color had long since surrendered to the dust of many seasons. A hat bowed his face, and his mount was a bay gelding whose mane did not plaster the same as hers. This horse's step kept a cadence as if it had recently eaten and had purpose left in it. The man dismounted without flourish and crossed the distance with the easy gait of a person born to stride open ground. He did not call her name or demand answers. He reached for the gelding with large, work-rough hands and took the reins as if they were the simplest thing in the world. He worked quickly, his movements the economy of habit, flinging his coat over her shoulders with the sort of practical certainty that happens when someone has learned to deal with numbness and exposure. Blood drained from Violet's feet as if her body had been taken down to the rivet. For a while there was no voice, only the scrape of cloth and the steady breath of animals. Her first sensible thought, when thought returned like a faint steadiness, was gratitude, simple and immediate. Her second was a small, stubborn characteristic she had not meant to confess even to herself, a braid of relief and displeasure that she had been seen as alone enough to die, yet beholden to receive aid. She would have refused in other circumstances, but now refusal was a dangerous luxury. "You're cut through," the man said, his voice low and calm, with a southern drawl softened by the plains. "We'll get you to shelter afore the cold eats you." He offered his arm and she took it. The money of the gesture was not about ownership, it was about the exchange of help for consent. She let him steady her to the saddle, let him position his horse side by side with hers. He seated her with the patience of someone who knew the cost of hurried action. When the gelding tried to balk, when the wind tried to whisper that it was time to lie down, the man urged the horse forward, not with anger, but with a dirge of quiet insistence. He wrapped his own scarf, frayed and the color of an old map, around the back of her neck, tightening it against the chill. The phrase he said then held a weight as small as a grain of corn, and as immense as a promise. He leaned down, his breath a warm thing in the cold, and said, "Not on my watch." Those 4 words fit into Violet's chest like a hand finding a place to hold. They were not thunderous, not a vow shouted across a canyon. They were the single steady light of the kind of practical heroism the frontier favored. He led them away from the path and over bone-rattling ground to a line shack, a squat, stubborn building whose windows were small and whose door protested like an old man. Smoke steamed faintly from its chimney, and the sight of its glow was like the answer to a long-asked question. Inside, the shack smelled of wood smoke and oil lamp, of wet wool and the animal tang that lives where men and horses have left tracks. There was a stove, black and patient on its legs, and a small bed shoved into the corner with a braided rug like a map of other lives. The man moved with the care of someone accustomed to mending the broken and patching what the world might not otherwise fix. He built the fire with swift, certain hands, setting kindling like small bones and breathing life into them until a throat of flame took and began to warm the room. There was work to do. The wet clothing tugged at Violet's skin with a coldness that made her attempt to undress like undressing in a stream. The man placed a blanket across her lap and crouched to unfasten the heavy skirt, but his hands worked as if the thing being removed were a bundle of rags rather than a woman exposed. He moved with respect, his fingers deft and unhurried. Violet watched him in the way one watches a stranger perform a task both necessary and intimate, deciding how much to allow. "Easy," he said when she flinched, as if he had been afraid she might say no, and wanted to make the word a permission rather than an imposition. She nodded. Consent in that room was spoken without drama, by a tilt of the chin, by a small deliberate breath. He peeled the sodden garments away with the same respect he might give a broken fillet, handling her with dignity. He warmed a cloth and held it to her cheeks and to her fingers, coaxing color back into them. He did not look at her body as a prize, his attention stayed on the work. Dry the wet, warm the cold, keep the breathing steady. Violet could have died in that shack and called it a mercy, but she felt more than mercy. She felt something that smelled of slow-building trust. The homeless ache of winter began to back off under the hard kindness of someone who understood that rescue was a series of small acts, not one gallant flourish. She warmed before the stove, shivering into the thick blanket he had thrown across them both. He boiled water, mixed medicine in a spoon, and watched her consume it as if counting her heartbeats. Conversation was sparse at first, the kind that fills space without demanding explanations. The sound of the pot, the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of the wind. "You're not from here," he observed when silence had worn a comfortable groove. His voice was the same as it had been outside, a consonant made from practice in plains. "No," Violet said. "I came from Boston years back." "Boston," he repeated, tasting the place in the word, as though it were a flavor he might not always come across. "I'm Yates Fletcher." He put his own hand to the light so she could see the name of the brand on his palm, the little crescent from some cattle run tattooed by work. He spoke plainly, not as a man who needed to charm, but as one who knew how to be straightforward. "Violet Turner," she offered. He nodded as if he had been trying on the sound. "You rode far." "Far enough," she said. She did not say that she would have ridden farther. The truth remained private and steady like a hidden spring. They settled into small, honest talk that told more in what it left unsaid. He had a Texas draw, but had come north. He worked the range for different men and rode odd jobs between seasons. There was a hollow in his face where laughter might have been, and when he spoke of loss, it came as soft as a scar. Violet offered more of her life by omission. She had not been one to overshare, and the frontier had taught her that bare facts held more weight than sentiment. She spoke of Mrs. Henderson and the medicine, of the way blood would have been spilled in town if the fever had had its way. She gave him that as answer, and watched his face for judgment. He offered none. Instead, he set another blanket over her knees and said simply, "You're going back when the road clears. Folks will look after Mrs. Henderson." Beyond the stove, the wind howled as if it resented the comfort of the shack. In the glow of the lamp, the man who had saved her looked like a figure carved from the plain itself, a roughness shaped by weather and responsibility. He moved with a gravity that was not dramatic but practical. When he placed his own hat on the peg and removed his gloves, the work-worn hands stayed visible, a reminder that his life had been one of getting things through storms, not talking about them. "Why did you come?" Violet asked, when the question that had been shadowing her resolve finally found its voice. He did not answer with a tale of heroism. He told a simple story of being in the right place at the right time once before, and swearing not to let someone else go. There was a memory in his voice of a child maybe, of a woman. It could have been anyone the frontier had stolen, but the specifics were unimportant. "A man's got a duty," he said, "not always to the grand things. Sometimes it's the small ones that count." He said it again, as if making the line into an anchor. "Not on my watch." Those words settled into her like a seed. Violet had not expected to be moved by a sentence repeated enough times to have weight. She had been moved by the honesty of his hands and by the fact that, when he spoke them, he meant the day and all the days that might follow. The promise was not about keeping her from the grave alone. It was about the refusal to leave her in danger on his account. It was a practical vow that suited the plain. When the blizzard relented enough to set a road, Yates put her on a sled with the medicine wrapped in oilcloth at her feet and guided the gelding and his own horse back toward town. The ride was slow. The world had been stripped of all its words and was now a set of motions, the sled creaking, the horses breathing, the fall of their hooves as if they were counting the miles. Violet watched the land in a new way, as one might watch an old friend who had been violent and was now quiet, and felt a strange budding gratitude that lived beyond her relief. They arrived in Yankton to murmurs and the pressing curiosity of faces. Mrs. Patterson was at the gate before the sled had stopped, shawl up to her neck and mouth, a small circle of worry. There were hands to help. Mr. Reynolds from R, who liked to know the state of every animal for miles, the postmaster with a face of predictable concern. They lifted Violet like someone sharing an awkward truth. They fussed over her with the implied guilt of those who had said things about her future. The sight of her walking again, though bent and wrapped in blankets, changed something in the town's conversation. Guilt is a tempering salt. It makes people kinder with each taste. Yates kept to the background. He handed over the bottle of medicine and refused any made-up hero's chair. He took off his hat and spoke very little. When Mrs. Patterson, who had a knack for stitching together social pain into tidy conversation, clucked her sympathy and said, in the tone of one who gives orders with a smile, "Well, if anyone deserves company, it's Ms. Turner," he only answered, "She's all right." He left that night without asking for dinner or shelter. Violet watched him on his horse, a dark figure moving out into the settle of the town's lamplight. For his part, Yates did not hurry away because he meant to be rude. He hesitated at the edge and then returned, dismounting with the same patient efficiency with which he'd set the fire. He crossed the yard in the kind of stride that showed he had come back with a purpose less grand and more exact, to see if she truly lacked help and to offer one more small, social approval rather than a showy claim. He knocked at her door as if asking leave. Violet opened, the light throwing a map of her face in a glow that made her seem both more vulnerable and more real. He stood there, hat in hand, and the cold had left a fringe of white at the ends of his beard. "I'll be round tomorrow to see how you are," he said. "If you want company, I'll bring something for Mrs. Henderson too. No more riding into a storm, though." She looked at him then, really looked. The set of his jaw, the care in his voice, the way his shoulders had a habit of preparing for work even when no work lay evident. She felt old and young, and undecided, all at once. "I didn't expect you to come back," she admitted. "You ought to expect it," he said, with the kind of dry humor only a man who knew the cost of promises used. "Not on my watch, remember." The entire idea of being watched over, not as a ward but as the object of someone's deliberate refusal to let harm befall her, was foreign and oddly comforting. She made a small sound of surrender that could have been laughter or a resignation to civility. He stayed for coffee only because Mrs. Patterson pressed it, and the two of them exchanged a few small words while the town's gossip roved like a neighborly animal. People asked questions, took in the quiet of his answers, and measured the steadiness he projected. It would have been a simple evening, almost forgettable had he not, at the porch rail, caught her hand in a way that anyone who had grown used to the weighing of small hopes and risks might notice. He did not press, he did not make the contact intimate. He merely laid his hand atop hers and left it there as if he had staked a claim to watchfulness. In the days that followed, Yates kept his watch. He came with small things, a pail of coal when the town's supply ran short, a parcel of salt pork that the Double R had sent as part of a stranger's charity, a hatchet that worked better than the old one she had been using to break ice. More importantly, he came with a steadiness that made the town's predictions wobble. The gossip that had been an unspoken jury softened under the weight of repeated kindness. Folks began to speculate instead about other things, whether they might make a good match, whether Violet would take to married life, whether Yates would accept the chores of a house as readily as he did the chores of the range. The talk was inevitable. The town had always loved a tidy future. But Violet's heart belonged to the work of staying upright in daily chores. She was careful, cautious with the idea of companionship. She had learned to find pleasure in small victories. A stubborn sow brought in with its litter, fence posts set true, a loaf of bread that rose properly on the first try. Love was a different sort of craft. She did not reject Yates's visits, nor did she rush to invite them. She understood that to live in the frontier meant sharing hard tasks and not the theatrics of affection. Yates's visits were practical, a continuation of the rescue in smaller sustained acts. He courted in the way of men who had been untrained by drawing rooms. He fixed a deliverable, tended a task, left without a flourish. He brought a story from the range about a stray dog that would not leave, and he walked with her across the field, telling her about cattle and the way a sunrise looked over the ridge when the world was still held in the soft of pre-dawn. The conversations between them were mostly about weather and seeds, about neighbors, and the kinds of things that make a household run. On a porch that smelled of smoke and pine, he told her once more, quieter this time, "Not on my watch." It was not a promise that turned the wheels of the world alone. Violet did not become suddenly dependent upon the notion. She remembered how to tend a calf and how to read the weather in the curve of a cloud. She also liked the sound of the phrase, and she liked the man who said it, not because he was heroic in the way poems could exaggerate, but because he had, in the most practical sense, kept her from the smallest and cruelest of deaths. His refusal to leave her in peril had been a hinge upon which other things rotated. When winter loosened and spring hammered softly at the banks, Violet found herself walking the lane with Yates toward Mrs. Henderson's porch, where the old woman sat by her window, knitting as if storms were a matter for knitting needles and not the hunger of the world. Mrs. Henderson lifted a hand in greeting and pressed Violet's palm with calloused fingers that had learned to stir a pot and tend a child. The town turned in slow ways, amused and partial and warm. The verdict that had been written so loudly, remarks about loneliness and the impossibility of finding a partner after loss, softened into lines of curiosity and, for a few, contrition. Violet allowed herself a brief pleasure in the way the market changed. A pie left at the door, a drying rack loaned, help in getting a stubborn ox turned. Yates's presence did not erase her independence. If anything, his steadiness let her practice it better. She could take on work knowing there was a man who would fetch a pail when wells froze or heft a sack of feed when her hands were full. The courtship that followed was measured. He fetched a book of poetry once, a small dog-eared volume of Emerson, because she had mentioned reading in an idle moment when snow kept her indoors. She found this both amusing and utterly in character. A man like Yeats bringing a book made of paper seemed like a sign the world had not entirely lost its comic sense. He read a verse out loud on a late afternoon when the sun cut the world in 100 small edges. He did so without pretension, as if reading were another sensible task to be performed. They spoke of the past and of small griefs. Violet spoke candidly of 20 years of tending to the life she'd built after the fever took her husband away. She spoke of the nights when loneliness pressed on her chest like a slow hand. Yeats spoke of his mother, of cattle drives, of the way the land punished carelessness. At one point he placed his jacket on a chair for her and asked if she would consider, if she ever felt inclined, being more than a neighbor. The question was practical, not florid. "A man's got work to do," he said, "but if you'd have me, well, I'd stand watch." "Not on your watch," she replied, but not with a teasing tone. Her voice had a steadiness now that was less about resignation and more about measurement. She wanted to be sure she was not stepping into a shelter that would cage her instead of keep her warm. He smiled then, with the relief of a man who had been granted a small but dear reprieve. "That's right," he answered, "not on my watch." The town noticed, as towns will. Some found the match sensible. Others nodded in private and hoped that Violet's life would be softened for the sake of the children who would play on her lawn in some future season. For Violet herself, the decision was not instantaneous. She valued the solidity of the man opposite her. She also valued the life she had cajoled into being. She would not give up her autonomy. She would not let a single promise of protection make the rest of her life a matter of someone else's labor. Weeks became months. They went to church for a Sunday when the weather allowed, and sat apart from the congregation with the kind of quiet attention that takes in small details. The curate's sermon that spoke too plainly of providence, the way the light slanted through the windows making a patchwork on the floor, the hush after the hymns where people exchanged the softest of judgments. Afterward, people made kind noises and offered congratulations that were measured more by curiosity than by ardor. Mr. Reynolds offered to help with a tract of land if they needed. Mrs. Patterson baked a cake, ceremonious and laced with a crust that had the smell of approval. One evening, as the sun threw gold over the fence post and the field smelled of upturned soil and the world seemed prepared for small miracles, Yeats took Violet's hand and led her to the little stretch of ground where the wind had been less cruel. He knelt, not in a showy way but with the plain gravity of a man making something real. The words were simple. "Violet Turner, will you marry me? Keep house with me? Watch the land? Sleep easy knowing I'll be there." The question was the last remove. It was not asked for dramatic effect, but to make a life legal and ordinary and kept. Violet thought of the line shack and the heat of the stove, of her life of making things hold together, and of the man who had been steady enough to keep the world from seizing her. She thought of Boston, and of the secret of her own heart that had not had room for a partner until now. "Yes," she said. She had a dozen reasons and no reason at all. She had the stubbornness to believe she could be both independent and loved. She had the memory of cold and the comfort of warmth. She had the clear-eyed admission that some rescues became the furniture of a life, not its end. When they spoke of the future, they did so as people who counted on the land and the common work. A small parcel of deeded land, a house with shutters that could be painted, a barn for the gelding and the other animals that would multiply as time allowed. Mr. Reynolds shook Yeats by the shoulder with the approval of a man who liked good stock and better sense. Plans were made with the practical optimism of the frontier. A half-deed here, a loan there, a neighbor's vigilance traded for help with the fence. The marriage that followed was not a parade but a gathering, small and bright with good pies and the church's modest bell. The town, which had once whispered she would die alone, now talked about plows and paint and the pattern of children's laughter. Yet even as Violet consented to the marriage, she carried in her skin the knowledge that rescue begins as a single terrible act and only becomes a true salvation if it lasts. She watched Yates in the small hours when he would sit with his boots off by the stove, and she found a measure of him she liked. He was cautious with words, generous with work, and stubborn in the best way. He used the phrase less as a boast now, and more as a way of living. "Not on my watch," he would say when the roof leaked through to the bed in a storm, when a colt was injured, when bills needed making sense of. The words had become a contract backed by daylight and toil. They married with the town crowding the aisle and Mrs. Patterson pinning a ribbon the wrong color until Violet laughed and rearranged it. There were jokes at supper about who would chop more wood. There were the ordinary arguments that come from sharing a bed for the first time after years of solitary nights. Small things like the placement of brushes and the way one liked their coffee. But the arguments passed quickly because they both knew work to be done and had a shared sense of the costs of neglect. In the first year, they set about making the land theirs. The double R helped with a down payment, an arrangement that was shrewd and mutual, a bargain for labor and a promise of cattle to come. Yates oversaw the fence work with an efficiency that was patient and thorough. Violet kept house and managed books with an accuracy that Mr. E. Reynolds admired in a man too used to thinking of numbers and cattle counts. They both rose with the dawn, and their hands grew accustomed to shared tasks. Once the gelding that had carried Violet through the blizzard received a new saddle and a small hand-stitched pad with a floral pattern Violet had made herself. The animal seemed to show approval by the way he tossed his head when she approached. Children would come, but not quickly. The first year left them with the small wariness of those who have seen thirst and will not be reckless. They had conversations by lamplight about spacing and money, and the vagaries of a life that had little in the way of guarantees. Violet learned to trust in the rhythm of the seasons, and in the touchstone of Yates's promise, that in small emergencies and in the great ones, he would refuse to leave her. The phrase continued to anchor them, less as a romantic slogan than as a steady practice. The early years were not all ease. A drought once cut into their feed, and they had to sell a cow they had meant to keep. A winter came with a fever in the house, and both of them sat for nights holding a small child's hand while the fever broke and then returned. They learned the science of mending and not of miracles. They learned to rely on neighbors and to be neighborly themselves. Violet was ever mindful of a town that had spoken her future, and she chose to answer the whispers not with spite but with quiet labor. She taught a neighbor to mend a shirt, she baked bread for a widow, she loaned a cup of sugar and asked for the favor in return. These small stitches kept the community together. Through it all, the phrase kept its place. Once, when a rail gave way and a foal dangled from a pasture, Yates swung himself through a mess of splintered wood and pulled the creature free. He came back filthy and tired, and Violet, who had followed with a lantern, met him at the door. She wrapped a warm blanket around the foal and then turned the blanket to him, pressing its weight to his shoulders. He looked at her and said, without drama, "Not on my watch?" The words by now were a habit that meant he would take the night chores and the danger and the unpaid bills if need be, that he would not let harm come easy to those under his roof. The town adjusted. The old verdict softened into a story told in kitchens and on porches. Everyone had said she'd die alone in winter, but a cowboy had refused. He had carried her to a shack, wrapped blankets around her shoulders, and said those strange small words. They repeated it enough that it became a kind of myth, the sort towns prefer to the complicated truth. That rescue is a beginning and not an ending, that a vow must be kept in the everyday and not only in spectacle. And yet, for all the contentment that settled like dust across the house, the promise contained latent questions that would not be resolved quickly. Could a single refusal to leave carry over the years? Would a man's watch hold when cracks appeared in the body and in the patterns of life? Violet did not know. She only knew, with the certainty of a person who had been given back breath, that she could build, and that the building would require two hands. She could not yet foresee the storms that time would bring, heartache, illness, the slow change a life makes, but she had a single human solace, a man who had sworn, plainly and repeatedly, "Not on my watch." If this story returns what the town had taken from her, a measure of belonging, it would be because of work, not prophecy. Violet knew the difference. She would keep making bread, stitching blankets, and counting fence posts. Yates would keep the watch. The line between them would not be charity but partnership, a daily tending of a promise into a life. One cool morning, after the first thaw when the tracks in the yard were mud and not frozen rills, Yates came with a packet in his hand. It was small, wrapped in plain paper. He handed it to Violet with a piece of awkward pride and the same directness that had saved her in the white. She unwrapped it and found a simple silver spoon, threaded with initials, VT. The gift was not lavish. It was exactly what she would have favored. A tool, a token, a thing that would be used until it bore the marks of life. "Keep it," he said. "It sounds like a vow," she replied, smiling despite herself. He looked at her, the afternoon light catching the rough curve of his cheek, and said, quiet and certain, "Not on my watch." She kept the spoon tucked in the drawer with other small necessary things, the thimble with her initials, a spool of thread, a folded scrap of his first letter, so that whenever she reached for sugar or for a memory, the two were never far apart. He kept saying it as if to set the world on a steady tilt. Not on my watch. If this kind of steady, true-life frontier story moves you, consider subscribing for more. The years that followed took on their own shape, like the slow, patient fashioning of a fence line. There were plans to lay out, nails to be driven in evenings under the oil lamp, and debts to be paid in calves and winter labor. The double R's small boon, an arrangement of cattle and a down payment, made the first ledger entries look less like a gamble and more like a promise that could be honored. Mr. Yankton. Reynolds came around, as he always did, with a practical assessment of stock and soil, and handed Yates a list and a piece of advice as if giving him a recipe. Work the land, Fletcher. Hold to the low places for water. Keep the fences straight, and treat folks like they might treat you back. Yates listened and answered with the sort of nod that signaled he would do as told, because his sense of right and wrong was worked into his bones. They built the house in a summer that smelled of sap and sawdust. Men from the town came with their tools, some for wages, some out of neighborliness, and the house rose with prayer and sweat. Violet painted the shutters a green that reminded her of the Boston Commons she had left. She stitched curtains with the same neat hem she had learned in a rented room. The barn took longer. It was a thing of timber and grit, with the gelding stall at the back where he could watch the yard and the horizon he had ridden across that first night. Evenings were given to simple furniture and sharper conversations about where to bank the money from a good calf and whether to buy seed before fall. There were small discoveries, the way Yates liked his coffee boiled a hair too long, the way Violet arranged the hearth to draw smoke less when wind came from the west, the particular firmness of a mattress made from straw, and preference for a certain side of the bed. There were also old habits to be kept in check. He learned to tie the apron not as a supplication but like a practical measure. She learned to hand him the right size halter without failing pride. They loved with the steady arithmetic of two people who had been starved of certainty, the love of those who, having been spared, hand on the habit of keeping safe what they love. The first child arrived in a spring of urgent green. A boy with Yates' cheekbones and Violet's slow eyes, who made them call him Thomas, but everyone shortened to Tommy before he could answer properly. He came in a kitchen warmed by a hired midwife and the hush of a town that preferred to watch rather than fuss. They named him for a grandfather, neither remembered well, but whose name sounded good on a ledger. Violet learned again how to set a fevered lip against the drain of worry. She learned, too, how to divide a day's work around a cradle. Tommy took to horses with a steady certainty that made Yates grin in private. By the time he could run, he had already been taught to steady a halter, to know the difference between a gelding's and a mare's step. Sarah came second, a small, quick thing with hands that liked to mend and a voice that wanted to ask questions. Her first memory was the wooden slats of the schoolhouse bench rather than the barn floor. She grew fond of the smell of chalk and of the sound of children reciting lessons. As she grew, Violet watched a kindness assemble in her, an appetite for learning married to an impatience for injustice that would not be soothed by platitudes. James arrived last, lean and talkative, with a mouth that had an impatience for argument even as a child. He could sit for hours imagining debates with the farmers who came into town, asking what fairness meant when water ran thin. Raising children in the flat country was a project of constant adaptation. The work of the ranch required a certain appetite for risk and an acceptance of small humiliations. A fence collapsed, a birch tree struck by lightning, a calf lost to coyotes. At other times, there were small domestic triumphs, bread that rose before guests' arrival, a pie that won the county fair's modest ribbon, a set of curtains sold to a parlor that liked the patterns. Violet taught the children to stitch and to read the line of clouds. Yates taught them to ride and to count a herd without losing sleep. The pattern of their days, the round of chores, the exchange of weather forecasts over breakfast, was as sacred as any prayer. They sent Sarah to a teacher's institute in the next county when she had the chance. It was a long carriage ride, paid for by a loan Yates was reluctant to take and for which Violet argued like a woman would argue for a child's future. "She's got the head for it," Violet told Yates, folding her hands around a mug. "She'll pay us back tenfold in sense and kindness." Yates relented, and watching Sarah go, packed trunk, bonnet with a bit of ribbon, he felt, as if for the first time, the finite edges of what his promise meant. He had offered a watch over Violet. The larger circle of watchfulness now included their children and the world they would need to walk into. James studied at a county law office in the days when assiduous note-taking and apprenticeship mattered more than formal degrees. He argued small cases with the same moral heat that had marked his childhood questions. Disputes about boundaries, the rights of a woman to keep her livestock, the matter of water that made all else bend toward survival. When it came time for him to move on to a city school of law, he did so with Violet's blessing and a ledger of expenses that made the house feel thinner for a season. Tommy, quieter and more companionable with horses than ideas, stayed close to the ranch. He learned the rhythm of the herds and the stubbornness of the land. He learned that to keep a life you must be present for its small pains. They survived droughts and one bad winter when the snow lay in drifts that barricaded the doors and when both Yates and Violet spent nights breaking ice in the pails for the cattle to drink. There was a season when their money ran thin enough that they sold a heifer they had hoped to keep. It hurt, that kind of counting, for it felt like betting against hope. But each scarcity was answered by a neighbor's hand. A loan of seed, an old plow left for a time, a man who came through and mended a broken gate while he charged nothing for the work. The couple returned those favors in kind, in time, and in the care of small matters that made the community fit together like a well-made garment. Through it all, Yates's phrase persisted. It was said in quiet urgency when a colt was born breech and hands were needed to keep the life from slipping. It was said when a barn wall threatened to fall in a gale and men had to brace and lift and sweat until the structure held again. It was said in the hush of the nursery when a child's breathing grew shallow and Violet, hands methodical and steady, tended the fever. The phrase's meaning widened, no longer only about not leaving a woman to freeze, but about the accumulation of nights and chores and stands taken on behalf of family and neighbors. It became a preface to small heroics. The man who would stay up and mend a shoe for the sick neighbor, the woman who would cook a pot of broth for the widow, the family who would host a child until a father could return from a winter away. The children grew into their callings. Tommy married a woman from a nearby ranch who could ride a horse in a way that made him laugh out loud with relief. Together they learned to run fences and raise a herd. Sarah returned from teaching with an energy that found a place in the town. She opened a little school on a corner lot and taught with a steady insistence that knowledge should not be the privilege of a few. She took account of children's hands that needed work and minds that needed nourishment, and for years she fixed both with patience. James moved through law practice with the same moral heat, but with a growing capacity for diplomacy. He argued in courts to settle small injustices and came home sometimes late, hair wine-tossed, books under his arm. They watched their parents change, as children do. Yates's hair turned the silver of old wire at the temples, his jaw grew a map of fine lines. Violet's hands, once quick as a seamstress, took on the slow, decisive motions of a woman who has done more years than years can count. She would sit on the porch in evenings that had grown cooler, knitting or mending, watching the sun scrape down over the fence where horses grazed, feeling the soft weight of a life kept. She found new measures of joy in grandchildren's mischief, the way a grandchild would hide a sliver of pie in a pocket and look innocent about it. The house vibrated with the pattern of many feet. Middle age brought with it a reality none of them could soften away. Yates's chest began to tighten on him more frequently. At first it was a dull ache after long drives, shrugged off with a tin of pills carried by old Mr. Henley the mailman. He would pause at the kitchen door, take his breath in the way a man would take up a rope, and then continue with the day's work. Violet watched him when he fetched water and noticed the change. A slower movement, a different care in the way he lifted. Physicians of the county, there were not many, suggested rest between drives. Yates scoffed at the idea of idleness, but he answered to his wife's steady insistence when she suggested he sit and let others do the heavy lifting for a time. His first serious fall was sudden and small. He had been up before dawn, as always, to check a broken fence where the wind had gotten the better of their sleep. He came back pale, sat on the stoop with his hat in his hands, and said plainly, "My chest went tight, Vi." He would not let the urgency of it be dramatic. The town had taught both of them to be economical with suffering and grand with gratitude. Violet made him lie down and sent a rider for the doctor. The household held its breath. For a week he was kept inside. Dinners were simpler. Tommy and Sarah took the brunt of chores. "You're no man to idle," he told Violet once, when the house had grown quiet, and he watched the sun cross the yard like a clock. "A watch is work." "And a watch can tire," Violet answered, her voice small but uncowed. "You listen to me, Yates." He had a stubbornness about him that they had loved. That very thing had gotten Violet through a storm, but it could flinch too, into neglect. He learned, painfully, to ask for help, to let Tommy handle the drives to market, and to let Violet chart the ledger in hand when cattle put value in the bank. He listened to doctors as if deciding whether to accept a stranger's advice, and then, seeing how his hands shook when he picked up a bucket, he agreed to let the others carry the weight for the season. Yet the watch did not end. In winter nights when the wind made its old appetite known, he still rose to tend the stove in case the child awoke, or sat hands-on while Violet counted the breaths of a fevered child. The phrase became a gentle rebuke to his own inclinations toward pride. "Not on my watch?" He would say it as if reminding himself that being present meant sometimes accepting weakness and the help of others. Years later, as the family had settled into a well-ordered rhythm, the house spent a long season in the quiet of preparation. Their 45th anniversary came like a kind of small miracle. Two people who had promised each other in a world that liked to strip away security still standing together. They marked it with a modest supper, with pies and a cake that Mrs. Patterson insisted on bringing despite Violet's protest. The children came, their laughter soft as a band's, and the grandchildren chased like wind around the trees. Yates, who had become quieter with age and a little more reflective when twilight fell, surprised Violet by reaching across the table and laying his hand atop hers. "Been watching a long while," he said, voice that had hushed but not dimmed the edge of the plains. "Not on my watch." She squeezed back, not for sentiment, but because it was the purest acknowledgement of a life well kept. Then the worst part of time arrived in the form of a quick, cruel thing. One summer's afternoon, when heat sat in the veranda and the horses lay in shade like remembered shapes, Yates fell in the field near the east fence. Tommy was with him, and it was Tommy who drove the cart so fast the dust rose and the spokes sang. The doctor shook his head once he arrived. The words were old and too familiar. Heart attack. An old man's verdict sounded in a room that had thought itself past sudden proclamations. He came home from the doctor's ride with a set of instructions and a look that was pragmatic about the scarce tools at hand. The slow decline that followed was a study in love and ritual. He could do less. He could sit more in a chair and watch the seasons while hands met the chores. Violet took to walking him through the yard in the cool hours, teaching him how to measure a calf's breath and giving him small tasks that let his mind stay sharp while his body quieted. They sat often in the evenings, and sometimes he would tell stories he had not spoken of before, of his mother's boarding days, of a brother who had fallen ill back in Texas, of a cattle run where weather had split a herd and they had had to save what they could. He told them not to create heroism out of him. "Be steady," he said, names and timetables soft in his mouth. "Keep watch." When pain came unbidden, Violet knew the signs: a hand that trembled, the pallor that took the cheeks, a breath less full. She would fetch wet cloths, help him up, press a palm over the spot that hurt, as if that slight pressure could flatten the fever's curve. The children took turns. Sarah left her classroom more than once to sit beside him with a book. James came home after a court session to wash his father's brow with a quiet that had the firmness of argument turned gentle. In these months, the phrase took on a new meaning. "Not on my watch" was no longer only Yates' promise, but an instruction the family adopted for themselves, that they would not let him be alone in the end. Time, as it will, kept its work. There were good days and days that were not. There were mornings when Yates rose with the resolve of old and went out to check the fence, returning with pride in a job well done. There were afternoons he slept in a chair by the stove, suede cap in hand and a newspaper folded across his knees, though he was too tired to read the type. The family found, in the middle of this thinning, a kind of sharp gratitude for small mercies. A breakfast where everyone was present, a day when the fever did not return, the months in which the rains came and the crop stood. On a night when snow pressed against the windows like a compacted sea, Yates's breathing failed in a way that could not be hauled back. The room was lit by the lamp and the faces of those who loved him, who gathered not because of public duty, but because of a private insistence. When a life had watched you through, you watched back. Violet held his hand as she had held it in the beginning, her fingers mapping the same lines of work and worry. He looked at her with the clarity of someone finding his way into a room of remembered light. "Not on my watch," he whispered, the phrase thin but not diminished. It was not a claim to deny the end, but the final framing of a life, that until the very last breath he had tried to refuse leaving her to any harm that could have been stopped by him. He said it as a benediction, and as a benediction they accepted. His watch, fulfilled, made the end a thing that belonged to the household, as much as any birth had belonged to them. Those present had kept vigil, and met the moment with the blunt tools they had. The funeral was modest, the kind of gathering common to a place where lives were tracked like seasons and measured by chores and kindnesses. Men from the range stood with dusty hats in hand, neighbors stood with faces wind-browned, and children scuffed the dirt out of a mixture of grief and curiosity that had always gathered in corners. Mrs. Patterson sang softly for the procession. Mr. Reynolds shook hands and told a tidy, practical eulogy about the sort of man Yates had been. They buried him on the hill that looked out over the property, where the wind took the scent of hay, and the world seemed honest and plain. Violet stood by the grave and watched the earth cover what had been flesh and bone, and though the cold of that day bit at her hands and the wind felt like a reproach, she felt a strange, quiet approval. He had kept his watch. Life after Yates' death demanded a new kind of work. The ranch was not vanquished by grief. It required hands just as it had before. Violet did not become small in the wake of his absence. Her independence, once tempered by partnership, now took on a new form, stewardship. She sat at the ledger again, signed papers, bargained with buyers, sent letters and received receipts. Tommy, who had grown into a man of practical skill, took the brunt of physical labor. Sarah returned more permanently to the town to organize a community fund for the school, and James made trips back and forth with legal matters that comforted as much as they mended. Violet taught them, in small ways, how to bear a legacy, with honesty at market and warmth at the table. There were seasons of quiet that became thin with feeling. Violet sat often in the porch swing, the same lamp that had warmed those early nights now bent toward a new angle with the years. She would sometimes walk to the line shack where they'd first met. The small square of glass in the window gleamed in the sun like an old bead. The place was kept more as a remembrance than as utility. Every child knew the story of the night of snow, and every grandchild had heard it told by a grown voice that emphasized the man's hands and the coat wrapped tight. Violet's grief did not harden into bitterness. Instead, it became a calm reservoir she could draw from to encourage the young and correct the foolish. She sat at church services and sometimes taught the younger women the sensible arts of preserving meat and mending socks. She attended town meetings where Sarah pressed the committee for better supplies for the school. She took pride in the way her children had flourished, and in the small ways the ranch prospered through seasons of good weather and the hard edges of poor ones. She was the shape the family returned to, grandmother, matron, steward, her watch now an emblem that she extended to others. Years more slid into place. Violet's hands grew knotted as the lines of her palms deepened. Gray hair threaded itself into a crown around her face. She walked with a soft cane at first, and then with just the habit of a more measured pace. There were afternoons when she would sit with the grandchildren and tell stories by the stove, of Boston curtains and the first rented room, of the man who appeared out of a white landscape and who had used a coat where words failed. They leaned in around her like small boats, eyes wide, accepting that tale as the moral geography of their family. The phrase, "not on my watch," became a family talisman. It was said in jest when a boy dared to climb a too-high fence. It was said in seriousness when a daughter prepared to go away for training. They carved it once into a small plaque that hung in Violet's kitchen, the letters smoothed by hands that read and reread it. It was also etched into the minds of neighbors and friends, who told the story to new arrivals as evidence of how a town could be remade by a single steadfast act. Violet's final years were full of small, deliberate acts of care. She catalogued the deeds and the receipts one steady evening, placing them in order for Tommy to take over as head when the time came, and for Sarah to consult when the school needed support. She taught the cook how she liked her bread, and she instructed the children on the precise handling of Yates's toolbox, how to oil the hinge, how to make a rope knot that would hold. These acts, both mundane and intimate, were her way of passing on a watch that did not belong to a single man, but to a family and a place. When her time came, it arrived with the same unembellished dignity that had marked her life. She had a long life measured in labors and loves, the kind that looks plain on the outside and profound when you count the small mercies. On a morning when the snow dressed the fields in thin lace, Violet lay in the bed she had made and held Tommy's hand, feeling the pulse of a lineage continue. Her breathing slowed as a winter creek slows to ice. Sarah was there with the school books folded beside her. James had come down from town and had a look about him that married grief to gratitude. The grandchildren braided her hair loosely and told her of the children they themselves expected. She smiled in a way that was both private and a benediction. "Watch," she whispered to them, naming no one in particular, a slight order and a final gift. "Keep the watch." They buried her with him on the gentle hill that overlooked the land they had made. The stone between them was plain and weathered in the way that granite becomes honest with wind. The inscription, chosen with a kind of respectful humor, read their names side by side. Beneath, in letters chiseled by their son Tommy, they had a single line, "Not on my watch." It was both Yates' phrase and an affirmation by a family that had learned to keep each other, come storm or thaw. The story did not end with their resting. The ranch, like any sensible thing, moved through the hands of those they had raised. Tommy took the lead in maintaining herds and in keeping the fences as his father had taught him. Sarah's school thrived into a small institution that outlived some of the earlier debates about economy and education. James's law practice made him a figure who could steer local disputes toward equity rather than rancor. The grandchildren brought innovations. Steel plows replaced an old iron one. A well pump eased the labor of fetching water, and each change was debated in a manner that honored the past while conceding to progress. None of these innovations diminished the story. Each was simply another chapter in a house built on watchfulness and steadiness. Neighbors told the tale of Violet Turner and Yates Fletcher in the same low, admiring voice they used for good cattle in fair weather. It became a knot in the town's narrative. Everyone had said she would die alone in winter, they would say, and a cowboy had refused. In winter evenings, when the wind skated over the plain and the line shack's outline showed as if under a thin blue bruise of light, families would tell their children about 4 words that began a life. "Not on my watch." They taught it not as a promise of invulnerability, but as a standard, a way to live. Decades edged forward and the world beyond the ridge altered in ways both subtle and profound. Roads improved, machines came to do heavy lifting. The ranch adapted with the pragmatic stubbornness of people who knew the cost of labor. Yet the memory remained, untarnished, not mythic, but a true story relayed by many voices. The plaque in Violet's kitchen is moved and kept on an upper shelf. In a trunk in the attic, there is a worn hat with Yates's shape and the old spoon, edges dulled by use. On certain cold nights, a great-grandchild will walk up the hill where those 2 stones lie and will lay a small bouquet, dried lavender tied by a ribbon, as if offering it to 2 guardians of a long survival. The younger ones, less convinced by the hard weather, ask why the story matters. An older voice will say, "Because watchfulness makes a life," and then tell the story of how a man rode into a storm and into a life. They will repeat the words, leaning close to the headstone, because words like these want to be said aloud. Violet never did die alone in winter. The town's verdict had been a rumor without witness. The truth, found in the small record of years, showed a woman who was rescued and who, in return, rescued others in her stead. Yates's refusal to let her be claimed by cold had been the first kind of rescue, yes, but the greater rescue was the way they built a life that refused solitude, not by demonstration but by daily acts of keeping. They watched houses, they watched children, they watched neighbors through bad winters and bad decisions. They watched farms through droughts and barns through gale. They watched love into a family that remembered. At the edge of the century, when the town had a telephone box and a road that accepted a new kind of carriage, the story of Violet and Yates continued to be told the same way. Stories are told where things must be remembered, plainly, with gratitude, with the kind of detail that has both the bluntness of truth and the tenderness of affection. People would walk down the lane and point to the line shack and the small window and say, "There, see how small it was." The world is mostly like that at first. It's the staying that matters. Then they'd tell how the phrase had been used to keep a colt alive, to steady a neighbor, to make a child feel safe at night. The last voice in the tale is often that of a student at Sarah's old school, a child who decades after Violet's death still believed in the power of being looked after. They would say, it wasn't just rescue, it was a promise kept in the everyday. The simple refrain taught by a man who rode into white and handed over his coat, "Not on my watch," had reached beyond the initial drama and become a measure. It had become a way the family judged their days. Did we make sure no one was left out in the cold? Did we look after those who could not look after themselves? These were the questions cast as a test at every generation's hearth. As the ranch moved beyond the hands of those present in the first telling, it did not become a museum. It became a living place where the phrase on the stone and the stories in the kitchen carried as much weight as the ledger. New hands learned to mend the fence, new voices learned to be careful with the vulnerable. And in the harshness of winter nights, in the hush after a child's cough eases or a widow receives a parcel of provisions, the family knew the old kind of solidity had outlived the rumor that once suggested otherwise. The tale ends, if it can be said to end, on the small hill above the ranch on a winter evening when the wind was not wholly merciless, as it occasionally granted a temperate grace. A family had gathered, descendants of Violet's long reach, hands in pockets, cheeks pinched red by the cold. They placed a wreath at the footstone and told the children the story again, about the town that said she'd die alone, and about the cowboy who refused to believe it. They argued, as families do, about the phrasing and the correct pronunciation of a long-ago drawl, but all agreed on the essential point. These two had kept a watch. "Not on my watch," said Tommy's granddaughter, repeating the line as if to practice the cadence. "Not on my watch," answered a boy who had listened to the story from the sag of his mother's lap. The words, soft and frayed with age, carried across the field like a small promise renewed. They sank into the earth and into the memory like seeds, waiting to be tended by hands not yet old enough to know the full meaning, and yet old enough to hear the obligation in them. That is what the cowboy refused. Not simply a single night's surrender to snow, but the acceptance that a life could be left unwatched. He refused the town's easy verdict with a coat and a handful of kindness. And through that refusal, kept day after day, year after year, he left behind something more durable than gossip, a watch that learned to hand itself to others.